Blue Archive is a special game, arguably underrated despite the growing and active community, despite the art that's drawn all over the place of the characters in the game, despite the good sales. It, as a game, has a tumultuous reputation. It's good in terms of story, it's good in terms of characterization, and the game itself is not that bad. But I do believe that the characters themselves, the setting of the game itself, I mean, you're giving high schoolers guns. I think depending on the context, it's a very awkward situation. And just even if you don't know that much information about the game, you normally know some information about the characters. And the main thing people tend to look at is the characters and then the age of the characters, and then they look at the drawn art of the characters, and that gives Blue Archive a much worse reputation than I think it deserves. But if you compare the Blue Archive reputation, the community itself, to something like Genshin Impact, the most well-known gacha, then there is some similarities and differences. The community on both sides is a bit iffy. You can go to one side of the community and have a bad time, but Genshin's is arguably much more noticeable. But if you turn your attention to the games themselves, then what you're looking at is a game that focuses and prioritizes the characters rather than focusing on an open world or the gameplay itself. Don't get me wrong, you have unique characters with unique skills and abilities in Blue Archive, but that's not necessarily the main reason you would pull for them. Sure, one of them is going to be a meta tank, or you might have a really solid unit early game, or something great for PvP. But excluding that, I think the vast majority of individuals will summon for a character they either like the design of and personality of, or a character who they're very interested in learning more about. You see, I previously mentioned that Blue Archive puts its story first and foremost, and as a direct result of that, the story and the characters being centered first for a lot of individuals, it introduces them to maybe new units they probably weren't interested in or weren't keen on getting or building. And it incentivizes people in a different way to roll, to pull, to build, and to invest into these units, because you might find yourself really liking one. And if that is the case, if you do find yourself liking a certain unit, that's perfectly fine. They don't have to be meta. Blue Archive doesn't seem to force you to care about the meta in that sense. And I think it's because the gameplay is almost secondary to the story and the characters. I compare Blue Archive to Genshin Impact a lot, and that's primarily because most individuals know and have played Genshin or have at least watched it to some degree. But if I'm comparing it to something like Arknight has a very good story. It's put first and foremost because you progress it as you do missions, so there isn't necessarily a separate story tab you go to. But with Arknight, something else you have to consider is the art style is great, but the characters themselves don't necessarily get their own sub-stories dedicated to them. So even though the story's put first, it's not necessarily a game that makes me care about the characters that I have. This works to its disadvantage and its advantage. If you're someone who just wants to get to a new unit or who wants to farm materials to build up certain units, you just end up skipping through the story. Whereas with Blue Archive, when you have the game, you can just play the game, do the missions, that's it, and you don't have to care about the story. The game rewards you on both sides. If you complete a mission with 3 stars and you do everything, you get a bunch of summoning currency, power zenny. But then if you also go to the side thing and check out the story itself, the main storyline, and complete those little episodes, you do also get Pyrozenny. The game rewards you in both aspects, from playing the game to watching and learning about the story itself, to even your character's sub-stories and your club's sub-stories. I think Blue Archive understands the point and the draw of a lot of these units is the character, is the personality, and the live 2D, don't get me wrong. And I think because of that, it wants to reward you and incentivize people to check out these characters. Maybe one you previously didn't think you were interested in, or maybe one you got and were disappointed about or didn't like. Those incentives don't get me wrong, you can just click on the story episode and there's a relationship story and just skip it entirely and get the Pyrozenny at the end of it. That is a perfectly valid method for just speedrunning the game, getting the materials, and leaving. However, you also have the option of not doing that. You have the option of just listening. And I think it's because you have this choice. I think it's because the game primarily just gives you the option. You can either ignore the story entirely and focus on the gameplay. You can focus solely on the story, which does require some gameplay, don't get me wrong, or you can do both pretty much equally. And in my case scenario, I focused on the gameplay to boost up my character that I liked, Izuna and otherwise, and then I focused on the story when I ran out of stamina and essentially needed something else to do. Because of this, because I had the option of doing it, I didn't feel forced to pay attention to a story that I didn't care about, and I also didn't feel forced to play a game that I didn't like. There are times when individuals want to focus on one thing or the other, and I appreciate that Blue Archive gives you that option. I also appreciate that Blue Archive doesn't solely put all its eggs in the basket of story or in the basket of gameplay. I think it's important to recognize why characters sell in certain video games more than others. If you're looking at Genshin, one of the most popular characters is Raiden Shogun. As of right now, the only individuals who beat out the Raiden Shogun banner was the combined banner of Zhao and Yelan, both of whom came out with their own stories at the exact same time, the current event, at least at the time of making this video. So if we're just talking about why characters sell and what makes them good, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to discount the fact that Yelan's banner could have sold really well just because we've had the Eternal Ayaka banner for an extremely long time. But it also has to speak to what a character does that makes them unique from others. Is there a certain mechanic that they have? Is there something unique that they do? Is it an animation? Next would be design, because don't get me wrong, design's important. You don't want a character that looks ugly, and you don't want to roll for them because you're going to hate having them on screen. And then I think first and foremost would probably be personality. Each game differs in how it markets its characters. Genshin puts these skills and abilities first with the character personality second, depending on the scenario, because you do have certain characters that just don't have a personality. Blue Archive, on the other hand, puts the personality and live 2D, so the design, first and foremost, and then puts the gameplay second, because Blue Archive doesn't necessarily advertise the gameplay. When you're looking at what they do on the polling screen, sure, you can look at the characters, but you can look at the rate-up info and the student info. You don't necessarily have a release that's telling you, here's what they're good at, here's what they're bad at, and here's vaguely how their skills look. You can find it online, but in-game, it's not necessarily as prevalent. Genshin gives you a trial, it sells you by the gameplay, whereas Blue Archive gives you the character and the live 2D, it's selling you by their personality, by their actual appearance. It maybe sometimes we give them an event. Izuna came out with her event, we had Hifumi in the swimsuit event, so ultimately, we also had Bunny Neru. Blue Archive attempts to sell you on the character personality, on the new unit. They don't sell you by the gameplay, and it's because of that that I feel Blue Archive is a much more special game. I played other gachas, and don't get me wrong, they have their pros, they have their cons, and each of them is incredibly different, and you may prefer one over the other. This video is not meant to deter you from saying your game is great or having your favorites. It's instead just meant to present that Blue Archive is a bit special to me at the very least because of how it presents its characters, because of how it sells them to you. Blue Archive isn't saying get this character because they're meta. It's not saying get this character because of the skill they have or the abilities that they have or any special perks they offer your teammates or where they're good and bad at, what raids they're good in. Blue Archive, it seems to introduce them and sell them to you saying get this character because they have a cool personality, because you like them, because the live 2D is great, because they're hot. Not gonna lie, some characters are made to be visually appealing, so if you find a character attractive, by all means, pull for them. Blue Archive doesn't make you pull for meta-defining reasons or meta-defining characters. You don't have to look at a character and weigh the options of how good they are in certain raids. You look at a character and just say, hey, I like the design. I think I'm gonna get him. And I think that's important because in that sense, it means that you have the option of pretty much using any character whenever you want. For instance, I said Izuna is my favorite character. I bring her everywhere. Even if I know she's not particularly good or the enemies are resistant to her, I still bring her because I prefer just having her. And I still have not had a problem with clearing content in this game. Don't get me wrong, that may change at certain points in time. I'm not going to discount that. But ultimately, Blue Archive doesn't push me to play in a much more meta-based or meta-oriented style. And I appreciate that. So, I know a lot of you prefer these Blue Archive videos. I apologize if it's a bit late, but tell me your thoughts down below. Do you like Blue Archive? Do you play Epic 7 or Genshin or Archetypes? Do you have another game that you feel is special and means a lot to you? My name's been Shanghai. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.